in a series on storytelling. It's presented by John Zimmer and Jim Harvey. We founded Presentation Guru about 6 years ago as a place where contributors from all over the world could share long-form articles about everything to do with presentations. This podcast is an introduction to storytelling. And as Michael Margolis, too handsome really to be on this podcast, says, the stories that we tell make the world. If you want to change the world, you need to change your story. And this series of podcasts is for experienced presenters and relatively inexperienced ones to give us a chance to think about simple things that we can do to add impact to the stories that we tell. Every single one of us can make small changes to what we do to make our messages more powerful. We're going to focus on 3 things today: what a story is, why stories work, and how we can all tell stronger stories. So starting with what is a story, my colleague John came up with this really interesting idea. He asked me to think about a story as a promise from the teller to the audience that they will get information, entertainment, and inspiration from the story. Whether you're gathered around a campfire, whether you're sitting in a meeting room or a village hall, the promise that the storyteller makes is that there will be something of value in this to the audience.
You think about audiences for the presentations and the speeches that we give and that we see. What kind of a sense is there that the speaker on the stage understands that they've made some kind of promise? In the same way that Tarantino or James Cameron or Jean-Luc Godard or whoever it is have made a promise to take money from us and give us something of value. So we talk about micro and macro stories. A macro story being, John, we'll come back to this later, but give us an example of a macro story.
Well, on a personal level that a lot of people here can relate to, if you are giving a presentation of 45 minutes, the presentation should have this macro story, a story that connects the beginning of the presentation, continues throughout, and comes to the end. The French have this wonderful expression. They call it le fil rouge, which literally means the red thread that runs through it. On a grander level, if you take, for example, a movie, and you could take, or a series of movies like Harry Potter, the 7 movies, all 7 movies, there is this story arc from number 1 to number 7. But within, then there are these little micro stories along the way.
And every scene, you could see a scene in a movie as a micro story. In fact, Robert McKee, who's a famous screenwriter who wrote a book called Story, talks about 3 beats of a scene. And he said that when you watch, and it was never something that was taught until he started teaching it, you look at good writing, you look at good comedy, you look at a good joke, that every scene in a film will tend to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. 3 beats to a scene. Okay. And I think, where does this come from? Where does this expertise come from? As John has written extensively, and many have, about Aristotle being the first person to document story structure as an idea. Where did that come from? And of course, what he did, he was, to quote a French philosopher whose name I can't pronounce, he said, what Aristotle did first was tie other people's flowers together to make a bouquet. And this fundamental idea of story structure is the product of 50,000 years of human speech, watching people gather around fires and in caves and paint pictures to share. Because even today, there is, I think, 41% of the world's population cannot take in information in any other way than through their ears, because they can't read and write, and that's today. And so storytelling is a tradition that goes back 50,000 years. And of course, as you say, the promise is to give people, to inspire them, to inform them, or to entertain.
Stories have been around a lot longer than PowerPoint or Excel or all these things that we love to use today, but they are really ingrained in us.
Exactly. We wanted to share a couple of other quotes before we get into the detail from an American writer, name that you can see here. I love this. You think about it. I was talking to a few people before. You think about it. A story is a yearning meeting an obstacle. So you're a finance director communicating some significant numbers back to an audience full of very senior managers in your business. There, and the numbers aren't good. And there's going to be a lot of that about at this moment in time. You could think about it. What's your promise to them? I think your promise to them as a storyteller is to understand their yearning. Yearning, for those whom that's a strange English word. It means a heartfelt desire or need. A yearning meeting an obstacle. And if we're telling stories about numbers, if we understand that every single person in that audience has desires, and your story can help them see a way over the obstacles, the cash flow problems, the sales problems, the cost rises, the loss of customers, that is a story that engages, even though I don't think there's any such thing as a boring presentation. There is plenty of people that can't tell stories, that just share information. And one, I mentioned Jean-Luc Godard, and we have a few French people in the audience. Well done, welcome. I always say to people, my mother was French, so when I'm with French people, I always say, it's my favorite language, it's the best part of me. But when the French aren't in the room, I tell them it's the English bit that I really like, but there we go.
That's why Canada is the perfect Jim. And we have the English.
Yeah, that's what Canada is, a perfect place. Yeah,
it's very true, very true.
Right.
And Jean-Luc Godard, so this idea, and I think something about stories as well, in business and in film, reality is too complex sometimes. Yeah. Stories give it form. It allows us to simplify, to clarify, to sharpen something. And I was thinking about Oscar Wilde, the Irish playwright, who said that playwrights tell deliberate lies to make a general truth. And I think if we understand the purpose of storytelling and using story is to allow people to see the possibilities in their current situation and move on, be inspired, be informed, be entertained, then something about us as presenters changes. Okay, so in reality, that's the start of what we want to talk about today. Why do stories work? Okay, John, this is something that you speak and write brilliantly about.
I mean, stories, as I was saying just a few moments ago, they are something fundamental to the human brain. They go deep, deep, deep inside, you know, over millennia. And we've become accustomed to these stories, to listening to stories, to paying attention to stories because they engage us. When I was a little boy, my 4 favorite words in the whole world were once upon a time, because I knew a story was coming. That phrase, once upon a time, you know, in French, il était une fois, or es war einmal in German, or c'era una volta in Italian, or kanya zaman yakadima zaman in Arabic, mukashi mukashi Japanese. I've looked at, every culture has some version of this. That's how ingrained they are. And stories are memorable. Some of you may be familiar with a wonderful book that I highly recommend. We'll put it in the show notes, called Made to Stick. It was a New York Times bestseller, written by 2 brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, and it's a wonderful book, highly readable, lots of examples, lots of stories about what are the characteristics of sticky messages. And there are 6, but the 6th one is that stories are sticky. People tend to remember a story because a story is concrete. It takes a general principle, it puts it into an actual example. Mm-hmm. And in the public speaking business, we have a saying, tell a story, make a point. Because people tend to remember the stories. And if they're going to remember the story, there's a better chance they're going to remember the point behind it. The other thing about stories is that they allow you to tap into emotion when you are speaking. And there are many kinds of emotions that you might want to tap into depending on what your objective for the presentation is. But I like this idea of, you know, the audience is your target. And of course, you know, you are aiming for the head. You want them to understand it. But the bullseye is the heart. The bullseye is the heart. And this is where stories allow you to connect on that emotional level. If we go back to Aristotle, he talked about connecting with logos, which is logic, ethos, which is credibility, but also pathos, which is the emotion. And, you know, as time, the end of your presentation, I don't care how brilliant you were, people will not remember everything. And as time goes by, they will remember less and less. But as the former poet laureate for the United States, Maya Angelou, said, people will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And stories have this amazing ability to get people to feel different emotions.
Thank you, John. And we're gonna move into the most important section, really, of the of this webinar today, which is fundamentally, how can you tell stronger stories? And I'm going to start by telling you a story that I heard. And for me, my biggest teacher has been other people telling stories in pubs, on stage, as comedians, at funerals, at weddings, in speeches. And this was an exercise I was running about 10 years ago with a group of young, new graduate starters at a consulting firm in London. And as many people, you know, they're very, very capable people. And at the surface level, we were running a workshop on communication. And I asked them to do a pretty simple exercise, which was tell a story that means something to you, and see what effect it has on your audience. And just ask them what it meant to them as a means of saying a little bit about you, about giving them some wisdom that comes from you that allows you to build a relationship. Anyway, pretty simple exercise. If I described the response as apathetic, I would be, they just didn't want to do it. I was working with 10 people. Why should we do this? It's not about work. Work isn't about sharing emotions. It's about solving problems. It's about this. It's, you know, fundamentally the reason we're doing it. And we got to the point where I sort of said to them, look, I want you to do it. And there was a 20-second silence. And the quietest man in the group, 22 years old, who very seldom said anything. I didn't even know his name at that stage. He just sort of said, I'll start. And I remember this story word for word. I've written about it in articles. It is the most perfect demonstration of storytelling that will illustrate some of the messages from John that come up later. And the story was this. He looked around in this conference room to 10 of his colleagues in smart suits and ties and me. And he said, my earliest memory is sitting in a hospital ward, looking at my father in the bed. And he'd been burned over 80% of his body. And my mother was crying. And we didn't know whether he was going to survive. My father worked on an oil rig in the North Sea, just off the coast of Scotland. And there was an enormous explosion. And he worked on the 6th floor below the surface of the oil rig. And it was on fire. And he was on fire. And his hair was burning, and his clothes were burning, and his skin was burning. And he had to climb 6 sets of steel stairs to escape. And he got to the bottom of the final step where he could see the door. He could see the people on the deck calling him out, trying to get to him. And he collapsed. He couldn't get up the final stairs. And then he said that suddenly at this opening to the sky, he saw me and my mum standing on the top of the stairs, her holding me and beckoning him out. And from somewhere that gave him the energy to make those final 12 steel steps to the surface. And he was rescued and he came to hospital and he lived. And I looked around at the room at this stage. There was a stunned silence. Everybody was absolutely, some people were wiping tears away. Some people were sniffing openly. And then this young man gave us his kind of punchline. And he said, so I sit in this room and some of us think we're having a tough day. And I think of my dad, and I don't think we are. And the silence went on for 20 seconds. And it just was a beautiful example of how some of the things that John talks about in the next section can really help us learn about the power of a story to influence. So many of us try and take the emotion out. When, as John said, from Aristotle onwards, the great storytellers build the story around real human emotions. So we're going to talk to you about three things. 4 truths, which we'll start with, 3 acts, and then one thing that we think more than anything else from our experience we should work on. John, talk about the 4 truths.
Yeah, this idea of 4 truths comes from an article that I read years ago in the Harvard Business Review. It's called The 4 Truths of the Storyteller. We will send you the link, but for those who are burning to see it tonight, it is available online. Just Google 4 Truths of the Storyteller. It will come up. You can read it, save the PDF. The man who wrote it, Peter Guber, is the CEO of Mandalay Entertainment. They're a big Hollywood movie company. They've made movies like Enemy at the Gate with Jude Law, Legend of Sleepy Hollow with Johnny Depp, several others. And it's a fascinating article because Guber was sitting around with his friends in the entertainment industry in Hollywood, and they started talking about stories. And the essence of the article is that for a story to connect, there have to be 4 truths. 4 true things. And if you have all 4 truths, then you've got a story that's going to make an impact. The first truth is truth to the teller. This is the person telling the story. There has to be something inside you that feels something for this story, and you have to be willing to show a bit of your emotion. This is why personal stories are so profound, because personal stories are a part of who we are. They make up the fabric of our personalities built up over the years. But it doesn't always have to be personal. As long as you feel something for the story, and I think we just saw a fantastic example of that in Jim's story. It wasn't his story, but you could tell that this really touched him. And I'd heard this story before, but I was getting touched all over again by the story of the courage of this man. So that's the first truth. You have to feel something for the story. The second truth is, perhaps not so surprisingly, truth to the audience. There has to be something in your story. It goes back to this idea of a promise that is going to be of value for the audience. You need to touch your audience. There has to be something in there for them. And so, an example comes to mind. Many companies will go and hire people as guest keynote speakers who've done amazing things. Maybe they've climbed Mount Everest. After they give their keynote about climbing Mount Everest, how many people in the company do you think are going to go out and climb Mount Everest? My bet is 0. I'm betting 0 people are going to go climb Mount Everest. So why bother telling the story? Well, maybe there's something in that story about teamwork. Maybe there's something in that story about perseverance, about overcoming obstacles. Maybe there's a lesson in that story which I can then take and apply to my everyday work at the office. That's an example of truth to the audience. The third truth is what he calls truth to the moment. Truth to the moment. And that means you tell the right story in the right amount of detail for the right audience at the right time. You shouldn't be telling the same story necessarily the same way twice. Good storytellers, the best storytellers, they tell a story over and over and they practice so they can shorten it or lengthen it at will. This is about truth to the moment. It's knowing how much detail to put in a story. And as an example of great storytelling, if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to take a look at Steve Jobs' address to Stanford University from 2005. He tells 3 stories. They're about 5 minutes each, but they're amazing stories, and they always tie back to the audience. There's that truth to the audience. But a story doesn't have to be 5 minutes. It could be 30 seconds. It could be 20 seconds. You've got to know how much detail to put in depending on the situation.
It's interesting, John. Just a thought on that. Was that speech written by Peggy Noonan? The
Jobs one?
Yeah, the commencement address.
Yeah, I don't know.
I might be wrong, but I think in my head I saw it, because I think Steve Jobs is a really interesting example. All of the things that he's known for, whether it's his iPhone launch or his commencement address at Stanford, or the much quoted Apple is for the crazies and the free thinkers with pictures of John Lennon and whoever on there. All of the things he's most famous for were written by somebody else. And what Steve Jobs did so brilliantly was he was Steve Jobs. And to quote an English actor, what he did was he said the words and avoided falling over the furniture. And I think it just reinforces the power of the story. What professional writers like Peggy Noonan can do is sharpen and shorten and add impact to that.
I still think that was my favorite speech of his, because it's the one speech that it was really about the audience. He gave examples from his life, but it was about the audience.
Absolutely.
He was Yoda to their Luke Skywalker, if you want to put it in Star Wars terms. He was the mentor. He helped them, as opposed to the Apple things were all about Apple. But
and
anyway,
it was perfect for the moment, John, wasn't it? That was a really good example of truth to the moment, as you say. Sorry, please carry on. Sorry.
And then the final truth, and this is very important, it's truth to the mission. And this, again, ties into, if we change the slide, Jim, this ties into moving the audience to where you want them to go. How does your story further their understanding, further their motivation to do what it is you want them to do? And the mission can be anything. I mean, it could be as global as, to take a very relevant topic, finding a cure to COVID-19 that has affected us all in a most unbelievable way. That could be the mission. It could be smaller. It could be turning around the financial stability of the company. It could be about motivating a team to play well in the high school championship of hockey, for example. I mean, these could all be different missions. So when you think about mission, think about what is it you want your audience to do.
Yeah. And I think going back to the story that I told about this young man in the consulting firm, truth to the mission was he told a story, and whether he chose it deliberately or not, but it was perfect for the moment, it was true to him, it was true to the audience and true to the mission, because the message they needed to hear was sometimes you've just got to stop moaning and do what you've been asked to do when you're at work. And I didn't have to say that. He said it, and it was beautifully effective in that sense. The whole thing changed. Okay, thank you, John.
Yeah, I'm just quickly looking at some of the chat. So Fred, a quote from Nancy Duarte, great presentation, expert. Personal stories are emotional glue that connect you to the audience. I love that. And then Hema asks, I'm always confused about whether what goes first, the introduction of yourself to the audience or start with the story to get everyone's attention. And Hema, my view is, of course, the best situation is when somebody introduces you, so you don't have to say anything about yourself. But even if you have to introduce yourself, it doesn't necessarily have to be the first thing you say. You could open with a story, very short story, and you get to the end and, good afternoon, my name is Hema, and I'm here to talk to you about X. So you can play with it. You can structure it a bit differently. Yeah.
Just another story, just one thing, John. The worst introduction I ever got was in Dublin in Ireland. I was talking to 400 salespeople from all over Ireland, and my client was a beautiful lady called Fidelma, who'd asked her boss, Paddy, to introduce me. I never met Paddy. We turned up 8 o'clock in the morning, this dreadful day, dreadful hotel, 400 Irish salespeople sat there like this. Paddy gets up on stage and he says, looks at me, I'm towering over him. He says, what's your name? I told him my name. He said, anyway, he's here to talk about something. If he's rubbish, we won't pay him. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the worst introduction I ever got. If you're going to get somebody to introduce you, make sure you give them a script. That's all I would say. Anyway, let's move on. So, second one. So we talked about 4 truths, which for me, I hadn't heard before, John, before we started talking about this. And I think it's a really beautiful thing. This idea of 3 acts is not necessarily new to anybody, but I just want to make a few really simple points about it. Because as John said right at the start, if a story is an envelope of meaning, it works because the audience at some subconscious level expects it to work in a certain way. And the simplest version of kind of storytelling that I've come across is this idea of a 3-act structure that was first defined by Aristotle. A story to work has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there's a brilliant article on the website from which this graphic comes from. about the fundamental principles of storytelling. So if we look at this screen on the left-hand side, Act 1 is bringing people around the campfire. How did we get here? What's happened before this? Who are we now? And what faces us? The start. And until you bring people together, you can't move them on. And at the end of the first act, the end of the beginning, if you like, there has to be this inciting incident, some challenge, some threat that is relevant to the audience for you to focus on and move ahead. That becomes the tension and the driving force in the story. If you like, Act 1, the beginning, is about why should we care? It's the why of the story. Why should anybody care about anybody that's in here? Act 2, the middle bit, is really how do we deal with this challenge? In Toy Story, the first one, Woody is basically accused of murdering Buzz, the idiot spaceman. The rest of them, that happens at the end of Act 1 when we found out who Buzz is and who Woody is and that the toys can talk and that the humans don't know. Act 2 is all about the rising tension of Woody trying to rescue Buzz, to rescue himself, to bring resolution to the story. He tries, he fails, he tries, he fails, he tries, he fails, and they both end up strapped to a rocket in the Psycho Kid's back garden being fired off into space. And Act 3 is, of course, literally in Toy Story terms, if Act 2 is about rising action and tension, Act 3 is about resolution. The excitement goes and the answer is given. And of course, what happens is Buzz, the idiot spaceman who genuinely thinks he can fly, taps his chest, spreads his wings, and they fly back down to Earth to be reunited with their friends who now see that Woody risked his life to rescue Buzz, and that Buzz realizes maybe he isn't the spaceman that he thought he was. And we go away with a story about loyalty and friendship and misunderstanding and the real kind of heroism that works. 3 simple acts. Beginning, why should we bother? Why should we care? Middle, how does this story get told? End, what does it all mean? What happens? What happens next? Going right back to what John said earlier about every story in the world begins with once upon a time there was a king or a family, and finishes with they lived happy ever after. Now, just one thing for business presentations, I always think something is that our job or in a presentation is to give the audience at least the chance of a happy ending. Okay? Audiences like certainty. How many people in the audience watched Lost, the television series? 168 hours of television that went precisely nowhere. Some people left after the first series, some people left after but nearly everybody that I spoke to felt let down because there was no, they didn't get the answer to the question that the story asked. So, 3 acts. I think one of the ways that you can really sharpen your storytelling is get really good at understanding the structure of a story. There are many models, but 3 acts is the simplest one that I've found to use.
It is a good model, as Jim points out. There's another model called the hero's journey, which is very similar. It was coined by a man named Joseph Campbell, and he studied religions and mythologies and storytelling across cultures, and it had this kind of arc of there's a challenge and there's a struggle and finally there's a resolution, and then, as Jim says, in the descending part there is something has been learned, an insight. The French have a wonderful word for this falling action. They call it le dénouement, which literally means the untying of the knot. That's what happens after the climax in every movie or every book you read.
Brilliant, John. So we talked about 4 truths.
Yep.
3 acts is the second thing, and just a couple of thoughts about how and this is based on lots of the presentations that we see. So how can we sharpen our stories? I think often you find, and particularly in business presentations, and I think often in a business presentation, particularly with senior people in the audience, they're impatient. And so we feel a pressure to get on to the point of the presentation, which starts really in Act 2 and ends in Act 3. But if we don't take the time to lay out all of the things that happened that got us into this room with this challenge now, you can find out that your audience is lost. And so the question for all of us is, in the first bits of our stories, is there enough in Act 1 that allows the audience to understand everything you're going to say? You'll know when you've made a mistake because suddenly people in the audience start saying, why are we doing this? Why are we doing it now? I thought it was like this. And we make assumptions that everybody knows. So that's one of the problems with Act 1. John?
And in Act 2, this is where people can get caught in detail. They can go around and around, and they're going from A to B, and on my way, oh yes, and I saw so and so, and this happened here. And do you remember him? He was related to so and so. Their child did this. This is on personal stories. Some of you may know people like this. It's about, again, this ties back very nicely to what I was talking about, truth to the moment. It's inserting the right amount of details for this audience on this occasion so that they can keep the flow of the story going.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. And then the last thing, and this happens, I think, more often than a lot of people would imagine, is the story doesn't really finish with certainty. You introduce the challenge, you talk about the numbers, and you stand there at the end and you say, that's it. Whereas actually, in my experience, even the most senior people, they might not agree with you, but they want certainty. They want an opinion. They want a direction. In the same way that the audience of Lost wanted an answer to the questions that the rest of the thing had raised. And often we can't give people a happy ending because the work that we're talking about, how can you give a nation the happy ending to this coronavirus story at the moment? You can't. But what you can do is give them certainty as to the steps that need to be taken in order for that happy ending to happen. You can't just stop talking. And so those are the three things that we think if all of us get better at setting out the case, making people care at the start, shortening the story, doing the opposite of James Cameron. The more money James Cameron gets, film by film, the longer his films get. Do they get better? Probably not. And then making sure that there is certainty at the end for the audience. Tell them what they need to know, understand, or do. And so from that point of view, those are the three things that we wanted you to talk about. 4 truths, 3 acts, and one thing, John. What's the final thing that we want people to think about that we'll explore in the later podcasts?
When you put the 4 truths and the 3 acts together, the one thing you want is impact. You want your story to make an impact on the audience. And a story about a story that always comes to mind is with a client of mine. She's a friend now, but she began as a client. Her name is Madalena. And she had a problem, and she contacted me. She worked at the time at a big family foundation in Geneva, one of these foundations that has lots of family money. They have all kinds of investments in real estate and stocks and whatever, but that's not what she was involved in. She was involved in supervising the charitable projects that this foundation sponsored. And in her case, it was projects related to mental health in countries that had been afflicted by poverty or war. Her problem was that her boss had nominated her to be one of 4 panelists in a session at a 4-day conference of all the big family foundations from Europe that was going to be held in Hungary, I believe. This is many years ago. And Madalena was going to be on the panel with 3 others. She was the youngest, she had the least amount of experience, and she was going to be speaking last. And each of the speakers had about 15 minutes to talk about what their foundation was doing. When we met the first day, first thing she said was, the other 3 have done PowerPoint presentations and they've sent them, and my boss has seen them and he thinks I need a PowerPoint presentation. Do you think I need a PowerPoint presentation? And I said, just calm down. Let's just calm down on the PowerPoint for a minute. We think about that down the road. Let me take a look. And these other 3, they were doing amazing work, but the presentations, you've seen them before. Bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, little picture. You know the style. I said, let's put them aside. Let's talk about what you're going to say. So we started talking about the different projects, how she selected them. She'd been working in places like Malawi and Cote d'Ivoire, Lebanon and Ethiopia. How you select them, how you monitor them, how you ensure financial accountability. And we're making good progress on the structure. And at one point I said, okay, I think now what we need is a story in which to frame this whole presentation. And I said, do you have any good stories? And she looks at me, she thinks for a second, she says, I can't think of any stories. Now, I didn't say anything, but I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, you've traveled to these places. You just came back from Ethiopia. You're telling me you don't have any stories? I don't believe you for a second. But I didn't say that. Instead, I said, no problem. We continued working on the other things. And then after a couple hours, we took a coffee break. So as we're sipping our coffee, I asked her casually, so how was your trip to Ethiopia? Now she's not thinking about her presentation. So the first thing she says, it was amazing. And I'm thinking, that's it. Come on, a little more, a little more, a little more. She tells me this story. And she said the first day she's in Addis Ababa, she had a meeting at the mental health hospital in Addis. It's the only mental health hospital in the whole country, or at least it was at the time. Ethiopia has 80 million people. So right away, I was intrigued. She said it's pouring rain. A car picks her up and takes her to the hospital. Now it was a big facility. If you can imagine a rectangle with a big open courtyard in the middle. She had to go through a tunnel, and in the pouring rain, she had to run across this massive courtyard. She said she started to run, and she took 5 steps, and she stopped. Because there in this massive courtyard, she said there were at least 500 people standing silently, waiting in line for their turn to get into this hospital. Some of these people had been walking for days. And as she's telling me this, my eyes are like saucers. And she gets to the end and I said, that's it. And she says, what? And I said, there's your story. So fast forward to the conference. The other 3 give their presentations, nice applause. Madalena stands up, no slides. We didn't use slides. Her very first words, very first thing she said, it was raining the day I arrived at the hospital. And she said 200 pairs of eyes just went, and she held them for 15 minutes. And after, she had heads of other foundations coming up to her saying, I will always remember this story. This is the kind of an impact that you can have with just one story, one well-placed story that really gives meaning to whatever it is you want your audience to do.
It's a really good story, John, and it takes us on, and it's interesting. So, you know, often people ask, where do you get stories from? So just in a couple of minutes, John, and we've had a comment from Fred, thank you, Mark, quoting Mark Brown, a Toastmaster champion, to find a story, open your photo app and start scrolling. The picture that speaks to you, there is your story. It's a beautiful example. So John, where can people find their stories?
Where to find stories? I would suggest 3 other ways as well. First of all, become a collector of stories. You've got them in your photos, but also carry around with you, whether it's a smartphone or a little notebook like I have and a pen. Observe what's going on around you, at the office, on the train, going for a walk. Ideas, stories, things happen, and if we don't write them down, we will forget. So just jot them down, or maybe have a physical file. You read something in the newspaper. If it strikes a chord with you, tear it out, start a file, or use something like Evernote online to clip stories. Become collectors of stories. You build up a bank, a repository that you can dip into from time to time. And then as you tell them, refine them, sharpen them, practice them on people. How do you react to this story? People's reactions might not be what you think. Second tip, we love to show data. We were chatting with Carla right at the beginning, and she was saying she was looking for ways to present information that is beyond the numbers and beyond the graphs and the data. The graphs and the data are important. I use them. But, you know, looking at this is a kind of a cute way of looking at the story behind the data. Now, it's not always going to be like this, that you're not going to have the nice little pyramid here. But when you think of data, be it a chart, a graph, whatever, the numbers didn't just happen. They happened because people did things, or they didn't do things, or something happened. And if the number is significant, good or bad, people should know the story behind the number. The last thing I want to share with you is an exercise. And this we're going to take about 3 minutes to do together. So grab yourself, I hope you have pen and paper, or pencil and paper. I'm going to give you, just because we are just checking the time here. Okay. I'm going to give you just 5 seconds to get yourself some paper and a pencil. And then I want you to draw exactly what you see. Turn the page horizontal, landscape. And I want you to draw on the left side a vertical line, and in the middle, a line going out. So it's like a big capital letter T that is lying on its side. Then at the top of the vertical line, you put a plus, and at the bottom, you put a minus, or if you prefer, a happy face and a sad face. The vertical axis, that represents a range of emotions, from very positive emotions, love, excitement, courage, success, to very negative emotions, sadness, despair, frustration. The closer you are to the horizontal line, the more neutral the emotion. The horizontal line, if this is a true lifeline, this is, the start is the day you were born. The end is today, right now, all of us here on this webinar. So if somebody were 40 years old, halfway would be more or less when you're 20. And what you do is you then start thinking about different events in your life. And you start plotting them more or less where they happened. Successes, first loves, birth of a child, perhaps job success, job loss, setbacks, maybe death of a loved one. The interesting thing about this exercise, if you want to do a true lifeline, then you start from the day you were born. But if you can also adapt this for business by making the start the day you started working at your company. And you restrict your stories just to company stories. So if you're looking for company stories, that's a way to adapt the exercise. And then what you do is you connect the dots. And this is your lifeline. Now, of course, it's going to be very general. And if you did the exercise again tomorrow, you would have a different arc because you would remember that, oh, yes, there was another event I forgot the previous day. So you can do this over and over again. So we're going to give you about 2.5 minutes with a little bit of musical background to let you work on your lifeline.
Signing off? No. Well, we'll give it a minute or so and see if people come up with anything. Would anybody like to say anything? Add to the discussion that we've had? Reinforce, disagree even?
Sylvia, yes. Sylvia says, will it be possible to do a recording of the session? Yes, Sylvia, you will get that with some other stuff for everybody who attended.
Yeah.
What's the plan for the coming weeks? Well, as Jim and I were saying, so next week is going to be rhetorical devices. And then the 2 weeks after that, 2 different topics. And we're debating what they might be. So if you come at the end of next week, we will know what we'll be doing for week 3.
But also, if you have a strong opinion about something, I mean, I'll give you an insight. We're thinking about the effective use of visual aids in support of speech, not necessarily PowerPoint or presentations, but how do we use visuals that illustrate and emphasize and amplify?
Yep.
And then we were thinking that the 4th webinar would be specifically about performance. How do you add charisma and impact to your individual performance? So those are the broad areas, but we know if you want to challenge us, to focus in on some of those areas or ask specific questions, send them to us and we will do everything. And if you want to contribute, send us your thoughts and we'll come back to you with a plan next week.
Jim, we have a question, very good question from Alicia. She says, how do you keep the emotion high when you've repeated your story several times?
So I mean, I'm just 2 ways to do that. I think going back to the thing, John, the truth for you, I think the thing for me about telling the story that I told earlier about the young man whose father was burned, I think if you connect with what that means, and sometimes that's thinking about your own father or your own child or your own wife or your own tragedy, if you actually think about the story that you're telling, it becomes real to you. So same way as you, John, every time I tell that story, I experience those emotions that I felt hearing the story for the first time. And then weird stuff happens. So I think it is connect with yourself, ask yourself how you feel about it. And if you find yourself telling a story that you're not connected with, get connected in that moment, because we're talking about really important things.
And I was going to add, I agree 100%, Jim. I was going to add something, and it's exactly what, at the same moment I was thinking of it, Fred has written the same thing. He says, it might be the 100th time you're telling the story, but this could be the first time your audience is hearing it. And so when I do, for example, Alicia, presentation skills training, I'm talking about principles that I've talked about hundreds, thousands of times, but I always remind myself at the beginning, and this is for a speech or whatever speaking event I have, it's not about me. It's about the audience. And I focus outward. And by focusing outward, you get two really good benefits. One, you stop thinking about yourself. So you are a whole lot more natural when you're on the stage or in the boardroom or wherever you're speaking. But secondly, it allows you to really look at the audience as people, as individuals, and to care about them. And that comes through. And audiences are smart. They pick up on this very quickly. I don't care what the country, what the culture, what the demographics are. Audiences can tell very quickly when the speaker is really there for them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And one of the thoughts that I think is the best piece of advice, don't try to connect. Don't try to add emotion to the story. Listen to the story and let the emotion come out of the story. There's nothing worse than somebody trying hard to be dramatic or, you know, really overemphasizing and dramatizing. You know, that was a dramatic story. The story about Uganda was a dramatic story that needed no force to come across. You told the story that she saw 500 people who've walked for days, stand in the rain outside a hospital. That doesn't need emphasizing.
No, I still get emotional just thinking about it. And not for me, the story, it's that story, but then it's also the story of Madalena coming back and telling me the impact it had, and she had tears in her eyes. And so it gets me emotional every time. Yeah. We've got a number of questions about signing up for the future webinars, because some of them are already sold out.
Yeah. I mean, for what we've done is we chose to use Zoom. It's the first time that we've used Zoom. And we have a limit of 100 people for each webinar. And of course, we didn't really know how many people would sign up. So if you can't get a seat, I'll create a waiting list on Eventbrite. So you can put yourself in a waiting list and you'll automatically be added to the list. But if you don't get on the list and you're on the waiting list, we'll recommit, because we've got time, John, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
We'll share the recordings, but we'll rerun the webinars as well as live events.
Record, yes, exactly.
We'll share the recording, we'll share documentation, we'll share links to lots of articles on your website and our website and other people's websites as well, but we'll run the webinar again.
I see a question from Marie-Jeanne. She says, because you speak to different audiences, and you have one story to tell, do you have to constantly adapt your story to the audience? And my answer would be yes. Now, sometimes you don't have to adapt it very much. Sometimes it's just tweaking one or two small details. But this is why the more you know about your audience, the more you can tailor your stories to that audience. To give you an example, a few years ago, I was invited to give a keynote address for it was Procter & Gamble here in Geneva at one of their big annual events, and I didn't have any slides. It was a 1-hour presentation from 11 to 12, and so I said, I don't need slides, and they said, oh, that's great. Then just show up at 10:45, and you can then just get mic checked and give your speech. And I said, would you mind if I showed up right at the beginning of the day so I could meet some of the people and listen to some of the previous presentations? And they were a bit surprised, but they said, no, you're more than welcome. Come on over. So I was actually there at the hotel on the lake before the buses bringing the people arrived. And I was there at 8:30 and got a feel for the room and then talked to people. But then what I did was I sat in on the presentations and I listened and I took notes. And I was thinking about things people were saying. So when I gave my talk, about 4 or 5 times, I actually drew in from what people had previously said. Well, as we heard from Sonia earlier today, as Marco was telling you previously, and in lunch, people loved the fact that I had adapted my presentation in this case to them by bringing in things with them. So yes, you always have to think of your audience with fresh eyes, but you may not have to change the story at all, but you, at the very least, have to be prepared to adapt it.
It's like that old quotation, John, isn't it? That says, no love letter ever began with the words, to whom it may concern.
Yes. Ken Hamer, designing a presentation without the audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern.
Yeah, it's true. No, I think that's a really good. There's something about tuning in, isn't there? There's tuning in before the event. So many times you see sports people who've got this keynote speech, and it's almost like there's a blank space at the end where they fill in the name of the company, or there's that transition to the final act where they've talked about these triumphs and tragedies, and then they say, and isn't that a bit like, and you can see their minds, insurance, banking, consulting, manufacturing, and they put the word in there, and the audience almost is going, but it's just so cut and paste copperplate.
Yeah.
I think if you just spent an hour, as you say, finding out about the organization and the challenges it faces before you got to the place, and an hour talking to people over coffee beforehand, then that little sort of clunky moment that's just stands out like a sore thumb is gone, because suddenly you're talking like you did. You're talking about Bob who works in the paint shop, or you're talking about Sylvie who works in regulatory compliance. You're not just talking to a blank audience of that could be anybody. 2 new messages. Thank you. See you next week. Thanks. Have a lot. Okay. Any questions or observations or anything to add from our community? We've got 30 people, I think, left, something like that. Would anybody like to add anything to the sort of collective group before we go? Unmute your microphones if you want to and say something.
Hello, here, Carlos Salas from Madrid.
Hello, Carlos.
Yeah, I think that when I teach or I try to teach some skills about communication and people is, shy or ashamed or they don't find ideas,
yeah.
I always use a very simple trick that you mentioned before, that is look for a problem.
Yeah.
Always there is a problem. And when they design their presentations, they normally, put the problem at the end of the presentation.
Yeah.
Because they start with the team, who we are, the story, the history of the company, the introductions of themselves. My name is John. I work here in the finance department. And I say, no, please, that is at the end. Let the people know the problem. So develop the problem, and if possible, make the problem, as the Hollywood scriptwriter says, the plot thickens and thickens and thickens and build up the problem. So the people would say at the middle of the presentation, Jesus Christ, how are you going to solve this?
Yeah.
And then you present the solution. And at the end of all, you say, well, I am John. I'm working in the finance department. So the people will engage with you because they say, Jesus Christ, you are a hero, or you are a person that solves a problem. So I always, when I trying to explain how a presentation has to be designed, I said, Jesus Christ, look for the problem.
Yeah.
We are in companies solving problems from the beginning till the end of the day. So what is your problem? Because I don't think that you go to your company any working day and you find donuts and coffee and donuts and coffee and meals and sandwiches, and you go to your home and say, Jesus Christ, that was fantastic. No, when you arrive to your company, usually you have problems. Your secretaries or your boss or your colleagues say, hey, John, we have a problem.
It's very true. I mean, who wants to, speaking about, Shakespeare, who wants to hear a story about Romeo and Juliet, meet, fall in love, get married, have children, die at 95 in their own beds? Nobody wants that story, do they? You're right. It's the problem. Yeah, the problem is the thing that engages. Absolutely right. Brilliant.
You just ruined it for me, Jim. Thanks.
Okay. I think there's a new version where Juliet was pretending. Anyway, so shall we end it there, ladies and gentlemen? It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for all of your positivity and thoughts. If you have any thoughts for us, we're going to send out a little evaluation form and some thoughts on how we can make it better next time.
This is the first time we've tried something like this.
It is, and we've loved it. But like we said at the start, our job and our interest is getting better every time. So we'll send you lots of stuff probably tomorrow or Friday at the latest. Following up from this, we'll see you in successive ones. And if you've got any thoughts for us, you've got our email addresses. Please keep in touch, because that's brilliant. It's been lovely meeting all of you. Be safe wherever you are.
Yes, please be safe.
Yeah, and we'll be out. Hopefully, we'll be out of this terrible situation pretty soon.
Let's stay safe, everybody.
Yeah. So from St. Louis and Barcelona and Madrid and wherever you are, have a beautiful day. Bye bye.
Bye, guys.